Hello, everyone. I'm Sharyle Patton. I'm a former co-chair of the International Pollution Elimination Network and currently director of the Commonweal Biomonitoring Resource Center. I'm your facilitator today, and I'm really excited about this webinar. Welcome to this webinar revealing chemicals and food contact materials, health threats, and global policy opportunities. Before we proceed, let me just add a couple of things. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made public on the IPEN's YouTube channel and the Commonweal Biomonitoring Resource Center website. Language interpretations are in Arabic, French, Russian, and Spanish. And you can click on the interpretation button down below for the language of your choice. So look down below the screen and select your language. There's going to be a question and answer session towards the end of this webinar following all the presentations. So please type your questions at any time using the Q&A button below on the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to your questions as soon as we can following all the presentations. So the toxic chemicals used in food packaging are a major source of toxic chemicals in all our bodies. This webinar will discuss research and an important new dashboard tool identifying food packaging chemicals, especially in plastics. We'll talk about why we should be concerned in the state of current negotiations at the global level that seek to eliminate this source of toxic chemical exposures. It's my honor now to introduce to you all our presenters today. From the Food Packaging Foreman, we'll be hearing from Justin Boucher, Operations Director, Dr. Birgit Geueke, Senior Scientific Officer, and Lindsey Parkinson, Data Scientist and Scientific Editor, who will discuss their newly released dashboard and all their research concerning the incredible numbers of toxic chemicals found in food packaging, focusing especially on plastics. Then we'll go to Dr. Jodi, who's Professor of Comparative Biosciences at the University of Illinois in the United States. She'll discuss why we should be concerned about the chemicals in food packaging and describe their capacities to act as endocrine disrupting chemicals that can cause very serious health conditions in humans. Our final presenter is Vito Buonsante, Senior Policy Advisor at IPEN, and he'll describe the current state of negotiations concerning the elimination of toxics in plastic food packaging. Basically, this is what the problem is, what we can do about it. So let's go right now to the Food Packaging Forum people. Go ahead with your presentation and screen share. So Justin, I believe you're now up.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Yeah. So yeah, thanks very much, Sharyle, for that kind introduction and for inviting my colleagues and I today to share with you all our latest research and a new interactive resource that we've developed we're really excited about. I think we can all agree that food packaging needs to be safe and sustainable, but in order to have really safe food packaging, we need to know the chemical composition of food contact materials, so what the packaging is made of, what chemicals are in our packaging. So earlier in 2020, we developed and released the Food Contact Chemicals Database, or we like to call it FCCDB. And it identifies over 12,000 different chemicals that are known to be potentially used worldwide in the manufacture of food contact materials and articles. And these are just chemicals that are known to be intentionally added. Research over the past few years has shown that there are still many, many more chemicals that are present unintentionally in food contact materials, such as reaction byproducts and impurities. And if it's not already clear, that makes the situation even more complex. And all these different chemicals are very, very difficult, if not often really impossible, to keep track of across the supply chain for all these different food contact material types. And that's exactly what my colleagues Birgit, Lindsey, and myself would like to talk about today, especially sharing some results from a powerful new and free resource that we just released to help get stakeholders a better overview of all the different chemicals that can be used across these different food contact materials. Of course, a key issue or the key issue with all these different chemicals is that many of them can move from the packaging into the food we eat, which you can see a small illustration of here on the slide. This is a process known as chemical migration. But so far, there hasn't been any kind of systematic overview of which chemicals are really present in food contact materials and which ones then actually migrate from the packaging into the food. So to help address this, we put together the first ever systematic evidence map of all the chemicals that have until now been scientifically measured to be present in or migrate from food packaging. There's a QR code here on the screen. My colleague will talk more about it in a bit. There's also a screenshot of the scientific publication that we published recently that gives more information. But really interesting, especially for many of you here today, is that we published an interactive tool that you can use to explore all the different data that we found across these studies for all these different chemicals, really yourself, and drill down to find out what information is most interesting for you based on your interests and your research that you're doing right now across your different organizations. One really striking finding of our study is that only 1/3 of the chemicals that were detected in the published studies were previously known to be used in the manufacture of food contact materials. So as you can see on this diagram here, that means that 1,868 chemicals were detected from these studies in food packaging and other food contact articles, and those are included in this FCCmigex database, which is illustrated here as the small yellow circle on the slide. But those chemicals were not previously known to be intentionally used according to the food contact chemicals database, which you can see illustrated by the much larger circle in green. So there are many, many, many chemicals that we found from the scientific research that we really didn't know or even expect to find being listed in these studies. And to introduce more about the new FCCmigex database and explore some of its findings with you, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Birgit Geueke, who led the development of this new study and has more to share.
Okay, can you hear me now after our switch? Good.
Yes.
Thanks, Justin, for introducing the FCCH project. I would like to start by presenting a few highlights and key numbers of our new FCCmigex database today. This database contains over 22,000 so-called database entries that form our raw data. And these database entries kind of describe all the single experimental outcomes that we looked at. In total, the database includes over 2,800 food contact chemicals that were detected in migrates and extracts of food contact materials. All the information in the database has been retrieved from 1,210 scientific studies and reports that cover 45 years of research on food contact materials. And to make the information accessible for everyone, we have developed a free interactive tool that can be searched and filtered. In the following, I'm going to present 3 short case studies on phthalates, bisphenols, and UV 328, which is listed as Tinuvin 328 in our database. These case studies are examples of the countless questions everybody can get answered by using the interactive tool. Phthalates are commonly used as plasticizers in plastic polymers such as PVC, but also used as additives in coatings, paper and board, adhesives, and printing inks. Bisphenols are mainly used as monomers in the production of polycarbonate and epoxy can coatings, but also found in inventories of other food contact materials such as paper and board, silicones, and adhesives. UV 328 is listed as additive in printing inks with food contact, but not included in common FCM inventories of plastics. Importantly, all the information I'm going to show you is coming from the interactive dashboard. So you can do the same for any chemical. If we search the indicated terms in the FCCmigex database, you see them here, phthalate, bisphenol, Tinuvin 328, we get the following key numbers. You see 51 different chemicals that have phthalate in their name, and we find 30 different bisphenols. There may be even more because searching by name may miss some synonyms. So the second column, the database entries, summarizes how much evidence we have for a specific chemical or for a group of chemicals. So to keep it simple, the higher this number is, the more experiments have been performed on this chemical, or the more frequently it has been found. The third column gives an overview of references from which all the information was retrieved. So also here you see quite some differences in numbers. In summary, you can see that there is a lot of information on the different phthalates and bisphenols, while the information on UV 328 is rather limited. Let's continue with a closer look at the 10 phthalates that have the highest numbers of database entries in the FCCmigex database. Not very surprisingly, these top 10 chemicals all belong to the group of orthophthalates. Furthermore, these numbers show us that they have been investigated hundreds of times in many different studies. However, there is much more specific information available if you filter the database. For example, we can select only those database entries for which the detection was confirmed. If we focus only on, or if we want to focus only on plastic food contact materials, and if we are only interested in migration experiments, the numbers change accordingly as shown in this bar chart. And you can see not only the changes in the database entries, but also the changes in the corresponding filtered references. Talking about references, let's have a closer look at the years when the studies and reports on Dibutyl phthalate have been published. We have selected DBP as it is one of the most frequently studied examples of phthalates in food contact materials. In this figure, you can see a strong increase in publications per year until 2015. And then the numbers remain rather stable. Overall, there are far more studies reporting the presence, which is shown in blue, than the absence of phthalates, which is shown in yellow. This is particularly interesting since there are many legal rules and also voluntary initiatives by companies aiming at the phase out of phthalates in all different products. Nevertheless, they have been frequently detected in food contact materials until today, as you can see here. And if you want to understand all the details behind these data, I invite you to have a look at the underlying references, which should include more information on, for example, the exact experimental methods which were applied and the concentrations which have been measured. Now we're coming to the next case study. If you remember the overview slide from the beginning, there are in total 30 different chemicals that have bisphenol in their names. Looking at the top 5 bisphenols, it is not a big surprise that BPA has the highest number of database entries, followed by 3 substitutes of BPA, which are BPF, BPS, and BPAF. And then batch is also on this list, which is also named bisphenol A. That's why it was found, diglycidyl ether. This last chemical is mainly used as constituent of epoxy resins used in the coatings of metals. Here you can have a more in-depth look at the detection frequencies of these 5 bisphenols. The blue bars show again whether the bisphenol was detected in the experiment, while the yellow parts of the bars show that they were targeted but not found. Rather typical detection frequencies, if we look at all the chemicals in the FCCmigex database, were around 70%, and this is the range for which BPA and batch was, or in which BPA and batch was detected. In contrast, the 3 BPA substitutes, BPF, BPS, and BPAF, have only been detected in 24 to 28% of the samples. We don't know the reason yet. It may be due to generally lower migration rates caused, for example, by polymers that are maybe less prone to hydrolysis, or because the substitutes have been less frequently used in the addressed samples. Again, more information may be found in the references which are underlying this data. Then 2 last figures on BPA and batch. So these 2 figures show how often a chemical or these chemicals were found per group of food contact material. So we didn't talk about that so much yet. So we have data on 5 main FCM groups: plastics, paper and board, metals, multi-materials, glass and ceramics, and then a last group where we pool all other FCMs. For BPA, we have observed the highest evidence in plastics, which was not surprising, followed by metals and paper and board. In contrast, batch was most frequently measured in metals where it is used in the coatings, as said before. Now let's come to the last example, UV328. We show it here because it is a candidate for the Stockholm Convention due to its very persistent, very bioaccumulative and toxic properties. You can see that we have rather limited data on this substance in FCMs, especially when we compare it to the data of the two other groups of chemicals. It has been only detected in single-use plastics, and the detection rate is 47%, which is comparably low. After having a closer look at the only 8 references on UV328, we saw that this chemical has mainly been reported in studies from China, and that we don't know much about other parts of the world. Since there is a global market for food and its packaging, it may be worthwhile to also address the presence of UV328 in packaging from other parts of the world in the future. And with this last case study, I would like to hand over to my colleague Lindsey, who will show you how to use the interactive tool and how you can get similar data about your chemical or material of interest. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. So let me remember how this works. Nope, in this button. Sorry guys. Justin, how did you make it change slides? Ah, there we go. All right, click on the screen. It should always be that easy. So thank you, Birgit. And as Birgit showed, there is a lot that one can learn from the MIGEX data. How much a chemical has been studied, which materials chemicals have been studied in, and whether or not it migrated into food. And so we wanted to make this information as accessible as possible to allow people like your lovely selves to use it. So I will take you on a short tour of our dashboard. Here we go. The QR code in the top right corner and the web address will take you to the page where this dashboard is hosted. So you can play along on your own computers if you want. You just have to scroll down the web page and you'll see an image that looks a bit like this. From this landing page of the dashboard, any user can select from 3 data views that we have currently available. The first data view on the left includes all of the chemicals and materials in the MIGEX database. The second button in the middle leads to a page with only the information on plastics. And last but not least, the button on the right leads to all the references that we read to create this database. So we will take a look at each page now. This is the overview of the full data set. On this page, a user can search for a specific chemical by name or by CAS ID number. And then they can select also which material group or groups they are interested in, which will filter all of the information that is shown on the page by that term or by the material selection. Then all the graphs listing the chemicals, and then down here on the bottom showing whether the chemical was detected, the type of experiment, and the, whether the material was single use or repeat use are interactive. So clicking a bar on one graph will then highlight that relevant information in the other graphs. So for example, this is the same image, the same view, but it now highlights all the information about chemicals that were detected migrating and into food. So yeah, and that middle button would lead you to the plastics page, which we actually only released yesterday. It is nearly the same as the one you just saw. It contains all the same visuals. However, the plastics page separates the MIGEX data into all the types of plastic that have been studied, instead of having it grouped together under one term. We have 12 different plastic types that covered 1,975 chemicals that were detected either through migration or extraction studies. And then the top 3 types of plastics were polyethylene, polypropylene, and multi-layer plastic as far as types of plastics that were studied the most. And very last but not least, we wanted to ensure that everyone has access to the underlying research if they have more specific questions than what our research paper or this dashboard can answer. So this references page shows the basic citation information for all the studies we read, and it is searchable with all the same filters as we had in the 2 data views. And we want to make this data, excuse me, as useful as possible. We have a new dashboard that just looks at the PFAS that have been studied in food packaging that is coming out next week. And in addition, in the database, not in the dashboard currently, we have more information on the specific applications of how chemicals were used, like if the chemical was not within the metal of a can, but actually from the can's coating. And we are still developing ways to share this information. And if you have any ideas or anything else with the dashboard or data visualization that you would like to see, we would love to hear it. I especially would love to hear it since it's my job and you'd be helping me out a ton. And then speaking of helping, this research would not be possible without the help of many individuals throughout the last several years and organizations that have given us their time and their money in support for this project, and our sincerest thanks to all of them. And yeah, that's it for us from the Food Packaging Forum. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And after everyone else has spoken, we look forward to taking any questions. But for now, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back to Sharyle. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Food Packaging Forum. This is an excellent tool, and I encourage everyone after this webinar to go exploring and find out what's really available. It's going to be very important to use this tool in further all of your further work. So thank you very, very much, Food Packaging. I'm just so pleased to be able to have this kind of tool in my hands for sure when we talk about PFAS and plastics. It's amazingly good. And so congratulations on that. All right, so Dr. Flaws, we're ready to hear from you in your presentation. So go ahead and share your slides with us, please.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Can everybody see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I have been asked to talk today about a guide that, in collaboration with IPEN, I worked with the Endocrine Society, that sums up our state of scientific knowledge on endocrine disrupting chemicals and plastics, many of which are food contact materials. And in this guide, we talk about years of research and hundreds of peer-reviewed studies and summarize how chemicals coming from these plastics may be impacting human health. So I just want to start by emphasizing that on a yearly basis, we are using 5 million metric tons per year of residual plastics and producing 270 million metric tons per year of new plastic. This equates to 275 million metric tons of plastic being used around the world each year. Sadly, only a small proportion, or 10 million metric tons per year, are recycled. The vast majority of the plastics, about 20 million metric tons per year, are incinerated. At least 32 million metric tons per year are mismanaged. And a recent study coming out from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, estimates that about 22% of plastics are being mismanaged globally. 8 million plastics metric tons per year end up in our oceans, and 250 million metric tons per year end up in our landfills. Now, this is a concern because we now know from very many studies that plastic waste contaminates soil, water, air, and the food chain. And we predict that this problem has potential to get much worse. So this is a graph showing from 1950 projected to the year 2050. And on the left is showing global chemical industry sales and global plastics production. And what this graph is showing is that we're estimated that chemical sales as well as plastic productions are going to continue to go up. And we're only about here on this curve. Now, this is a huge concern because we know from many studies that our reliance on plastic harms health. So we know that harmful chemicals are used during the production of plastic or as additives in plastic products. And we know that many chemicals in plastics are what we call endocrine disrupting chemicals. And these chemicals can leach out of the plastics into the food or beverages that are being put into plastics. And these endocrine disrupting chemicals can block, mimic, or otherwise interfere with the body's hormones. Now, one concern that we have is that these endocrine disrupting chemicals, while they threaten all human health, they're particularly concerning because they can threaten vulnerable populations. So we know from many scientific studies that endocrine disrupting chemicals pose the biggest risk at key points in the life cycle. Mom and her baby during pregnancy, young children, and children going through puberty tend to be particularly susceptible. And recent studies are suggesting that elderly and aging populations may also be extremely vulnerable. Another issue is that these endocrine disrupting chemicals can impact multiple generations. So we now have to consider not only what mom and dad are exposed to, but what the grandmother and grandfather or great-grandmother and great-grandfather are exposed to, because we know that these endocrine disrupting chemicals can cause epigenetic changes that are then transmitted throughout multiple generations. So we know from lots of scientific studies that these endocrine disrupting chemicals are linked to reproductive disorders, cancer, diabetes, obesity, and neurological impairments. In particular, studies show that these endocrine disrupting chemicals have been linked to increased risk of breast cancer, genital defects, low sperm count, prostate cancer, obesity, diabetes, asthma, testicular cancer, ADHD, and autism. And so what I want to do is spend a few minutes talking about specific chemicals that are in plastics used in food contact materials and tell you what we know about their human health threats. So I will first start with bisphenol A, which is often abbreviated BPA. This chemical is found in reusable food and beverage containers, food can linings, medical and sports equipment, eyeglass lenses, thermal paper receipts, and plastic water pipes. Recent studies from the European Food Safety Authority have shown that BPA is present in the low parts per billion range in recycled PET or polyethylene terephthalate plastic bottles. And this low range that's being detected in these plastic bottles is above the recommended limits for this chemical. Now, in addition to bisphenol A or BPA being in food and beverage containers, we now know that there are many BPA substitutes in these plastics. So manufacturers have been using chemicals known as bisphenol S, bisphenol F, as well as other substitutes. And here is just showing the structure of these different substitutes and its similarity to BPA. Now, the reason that this is a concern is that we know from many studies now that BPA impacts brain development and behavior. It's been linked with increased anxiety, depression, hyperactivity, inattention, and behavioral problems. BPA also affects reproductive health, reducing fertility, increasing the risk of polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS, and has been shown to cause sexual dysfunction in men. BPA is also considered a carcinogen. It's been linked with an increased risk of many reproductive system cancers, including breast cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, and endometrial cancer. Another chemical that is present in food and beverage containing plastics and is a known endocrine disruptor is a group of chemicals called phthalates. Now, these chemicals are put into plastic to promote flexibility and to reduce brittleness. And they're heavily used in PVC products, polyvinyl chloride products, such as piping used in homes, personal care products. They're fillers in medications and dietary supplements, heavily used in food and beverage packaging, children toys, and medical tubing, such as IV lines and blood bags. Now, phthalates are a human health concern because we know that they reduce testosterone and estrogen levels in both men, women, and children. And estrogen and testosterone are critically important regulators of normal reproductive function. So phthalates, because of their ability to interfere with these hormone levels, have been identified as reproductive toxicants. Now, in addition to affecting the reproductive system, phthalates can block thyroid hormone action and lead to symptoms like hypothyroidism. They also have been linked to diabetes and obesity. Now, in addition, I want to give an example of UV stabilizers. So these chemicals are added to products to protect against damage from harmful UV radiation. They also are put into products to reduce fading, inhibit corrosion, and minimize fog. Now, the problem is that these UV stabilizers don't stay in the products. Through either production or use, they are getting released into house dust and into the environment, fresh water, coastal waters, and into our drinking water. These chemicals are found in plastics, including many of which are used in food and beverage containers, paints, building materials, and other consumer goods. Now, one of these particular chemicals is UV328. So this chemical is environmentally persistent, and as an earlier speaker mentioned, it's a proposed addition to the Stockholm Convention. This chemical has been measured in the bodies of wildlife and humans, particularly in human breast milk. And we know that this chemical is anti-androgenic, or that it interferes with androgens such as testosterone and how they behave in cells. This chemical is also anti-estrogenic in that it blocks estrogen receptor beta activity in cells. Now, of the chemicals that I talked about, this is the least studied chemical. We know very little about its impacts on human health. However, this evidence coming from cell studies does suggest that this chemical is an endocrine disruptor and may pose human health risks. So I just want to end by saying why this information is important. Well, one major reason is we already know that these endocrine disrupting chemicals in plastics are causing real life health impacts already today. And the guide that we wrote with the Endocrine Society and IPEN is really to provide an action, a call to action to prevent more harm. If we continue to use more plastics that contain these dangerous chemicals, we're only going to increase our exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, and our health problems will likely become much worse. And given what I said at the beginning, that we don't really have a sustainable way of dealing with plastic waste, including its chemical additives, we really need to come up with ways to prevent exposure to a lot of these chemicals that are being used in plastics and food and beverage containers that we know impact human health. So major things that need to happen, again, I'll just emphasize on this graph that our global plastics production, particularly of plastics that contain endocrine disrupting chemicals, is only predicted to go up. And so if we want to start to protect human health better, we need to make this curve not go up. And instead, we need to have solutions where we don't have endocrine disrupting chemicals being used in food and beverage materials. In addition, use of fossil fuel-based sources that we know have hazardous additives need to be replaced. And we need to make sure that bioplastics contain chemical additives or do not contain chemical additives that are going to lead to strong concerns with food security. Now, on a national level, governments should be enacting policies that minimize exposure to these endocrine disrupting chemicals to protect public health and the environment. Based on research and policy, we may need bans on the use of some of these chemicals in plastics, particularly plastics that are going to be heavily used for food and beverage containers. That people have the right to know which chemicals are being used in plastics. So we need better requirements on labeling and transparency on chemical content. We need to have good requirements on extender producer responsibility, and maybe some market-based solutions that may contain taxes or other financial mechanisms to incentivize the use of safer chemicals in food and beverage containers. And companies really need to think about moving away from some of this dependence on plastics that contain hazardous substances. Now, on a personal level, it may be important for people that are interested in doing so to engage with decision makers at all levels from the local community and upward. And in the meantime, using consumer power to start shifting markets. So educating and knowing about which endocrine disrupting chemicals are in which products, and then using that information to not use those products. And instead bringing your own or BYO water bottle or takeout container or coffee cup or utensil that doesn't contain hazardous endocrine disrupting chemicals. And then avoiding heating plastic containers or putting hot food and drink in plastic containers, because we know from many research studies that this heating of plastic containers accelerates the leaching of endocrine disrupting chemicals out of the container and into the food or beverage. And so in the end, I would really like to thank IPEN, who were our co-authors on the guide, but also thank my academic co-authors, Dr. Andrea Gore from the University of Texas at Austin in the US, Dr. Paulina Dam de Pelou at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, Dr. Heather Pattisell from North Carolina State University in the US, and Dr. Lori Reitzman from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign in the US. And I would like to thank all of you for your time and attention. And I'm very happy to answer questions after all of the speakers have given their talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Floss. That was an extremely informative presentation, and I especially appreciate your suggestions for how we can avoid exposures to these chemicals by actions we can take at the personal, local, and international level. So thank you very much for that. And I think we're all looking forward to the questions following this next presentation by Vito Buonsante, who is, I can see, ready now to share his slides. So Vito, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sharyle. And I just want to make sure you're seeing the right screen, like not the one with my notes.
Yes, it's good.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for the previous speakers. I am Vito Buonsante, and I am a technical and policy advisor for IPEN. And so I want to talk briefly on how we can connect the dots between the science that was presented and the policy, especially in the upcoming policy space that where we're seeing a new treaty on plastics emerging. I want to briefly present IPEN. IPEN is an organization, is a network of organizations present in over 120 countries. And this is part of our leadership. You can see it representing over 15 countries only at the leadership level. And the way that we work really is to, first of all, our mission is working for a toxic-free future. So we're very concerned about all these, the increased knowledge about toxic chemicals found in plastic materials and plastic products. And what we do is try to bring the instances from the local level, especially in the global south, to the international level and to international policy processes. I'm just going to show you an example of a study that recently IPEN carried out in 23 different countries. And in these countries, we picked up plastic pellets that are leached during transportation, so before they become plastic products. And we analyzed them for 13 different types of, well, several types of chemicals, including chemicals that are banned, like polychlorinated bisphenols, and also chemicals that were already discussed by previous speakers, such as UV328 and other benzotriazoles. And what we found is that these pre-production pellets, so these are pellets that would end up in plastic products, contain really a wide range of chemicals of concern. And also they include chemicals that are banned, which suggests that staying into the environment, they tend to also act as sponges for other chemicals already existing into the environment. And so this is a particular concern. And there's many more studies and many more studies that IPEN has carried out trying to generate data, especially in the global south. So this is part of what the IPEN model is. So in terms of like, what does it mean, all the information that we're getting? And this is becoming more and more evident then that chemicals, especially in plastics, are problematic. A couple of years ago, there was a study that showed that there's over 10,000 chemical substances used in plastics. And when we talk about plastics, we also talk about these chemicals as being something separate. But in reality, probably few understand that really when we talk about plastics, we are talking about chemicals, and the fact that plastics are nothing else than a complex combination of chemicals, where chemicals are used in many different ways. They don't all end up in the products, like processing aids that enable the production of plastics or their processing, additives, which are the ones that typically migrate away from the food contact materials, but generally all types of plastic materials. And the monomers, which are those plastics, those chemical substances that then become a polymer, the basic structure of plastic. So rather than thinking about chemicals as something separate from plastics, we really need to think about plastics as a combination of chemicals, and the fact that without these chemicals, including these chemicals of concern, there's really isn't plastic. So we need to rethink a bit our narrative around what plastics are. And as Dr. Flaws pointed out, also bioplastics, which are not made of fossil fuels, do contain sometimes chemicals that are derived from fossil fuels and that are as toxic and or are the same chemicals of concern that we have heard of today. From a legal point of view, it's also interesting to see that here is just like a reference to 3 definitions of plastics that we find in the EU, in the US, or in Canada. Some of these definitions do point out at the fact that chemicals are the basic ingredients of plastics, but they don't always underline the fact that plastics are many different types. Like there's hundreds of different types of polymers and probably hundreds of thousands of combination of polymers and chemicals. But most of legislation focuses on the shape of the plastic or the fact that the material has a polymer as a basis, and but plastics are not all the same. Now I'm going to continue talking about how regulations of these chemicals, what type of regulations we have at the international level. And as it was underlined, the Stockholm Convention does take into account some of these chemicals, and specifically these benzotriazoles, specifically UV328, is in the pipeline to be listed for global elimination due to its concerns for its persistence. But it's only limited. It's not a systematic way of looking at plastics. And the concern is that the plastic industry and the chemical industry have already found substitutes that are similar and regrettable, as we've seen for bisphenol A. Banning, as it happened in some countries, has led to substitute with chemicals that are of equivalent concern. The Basel Convention talks about chemicals in a limited way in waste, and SAICM is only a voluntary agreement and has a limited potential has had a limited potential to change the discourse on chemicals. But now we have the new, let's say the new kid on the block, which is the upcoming plastic treaty. And we're going to see that there was a resolution from the United Nations Environmental Assembly in March 2022 that has kicked off the talks for a new plastic treaty. So what we would want as IPEN is that this treaty really starts to talk about health rather than litter. The treaty, what we know about the treaty is that it should be legally binding, but the objectives of the treaty are not yet defined, and they will be defined during the negotiations. But most importantly, the goal is sustainable production and consumption. And there is also a focus on scientific knowledge, and we can see how quickly scientific knowledge has been changing around the number of chemicals, the type of chemicals, and their impacts on health. So as we don't know what's going to be in the treaty, we know what should be needed. The fact that chemicals need to be taken into account, the fact that there should be a focus either on plastic materials rather than plastic products. Obviously, plastics end up in products. And as many scientists have been calling for, there should be a decrease in the amount of plastics, amount of plastics that are produced in order to be able to control them. And although the chemicals themselves are not taken into account in this in the resolution, there are many there are ways in which the treaty should be talking about chemicals. And I'm gonna just quickly go through 4 of these. One is the fact that the treaty will look at all types of plastic pollution. So we can think of also about how our bodies are polluted from plastics and the chemicals in plastic. The second is the fact that there should be a life cycle approach, which means that we should look at the negative impact of plastics throughout the life cycle. So it can happen at production, during use. You can say also at the end of life, or even back at the extraction phase of the fossil fuels that then become chemicals. And then more specifically, the plastic design and circular economy. We see that there's like thousands of chemicals in plastic products and in plastic materials. So redesigning these plastics to be more simple, less toxic is going to be a crucial battle to win the fight against plastic pollution. And finally, there is a focus also on health and well-being. And here, so therefore, it's going to be very difficult to ignore the body of scientific knowledge that we have around the harms of plastics and their chemical components. So to finish, I just want to say that as our top lines, there are 3 principles that we have for a plastic treaty that we're going to fight for. One is understanding plastics as fundamentally carbon and chemicals, like meaning made of chemicals that are derived from fossil fuels largely. The fact that we need to address the harmful health effects from chemicals in plastics, and the fact that toxic chemicals are incompatible with a circular economy. That would mean only recirculate in the economy chemicals that harm our health and the environment, and we should go away from that. If you want to know more, these are only some of the reports that IPEN has produced in the last couple of years on plastics and chemicals, and you can go on our website and find them there. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking a couple extra minutes.
Thank you very much, Vito. So we're going to go into a brief question and answer moment. And Vito, I'd like to start with you to ask you, how can people on this webinar and others participate to move forward this plastics treaty? How can they engage in this? Would you suggest local, national, or work at the international level? How can people really engage given the importance of this?
Yeah, thanks, Sharyle. I think the fact that we have a treaty that was decided to be negotiated in a very short period of time, it means that there has been like a widespread concern about the fact that plastics are problematic. And so that has surely started from a local level. And I think continuing to be engaged with our local constituencies, our regional constituencies, provincial, national, and for those organizations that work internationally, like keeping on putting pressure on our decision makers, but also not to be concerned only about the litter that plastic causes, but really about the impact that those plastics have also on our health, and a lot of those unknown that I think also this study that the Food Packaging Forum presented today has shown, like so many chemicals that we know very little about, and as Dr. Floss has pointed out, all these health impacts that are very well studied should be also a concern to decision makers.
Thank you for that answer. There's just another clarification question for you, Vito. Will the treaty on plastics be binding? And is the reduction of overall production and use volumes an explicit goal of this treaty?
That's part of the unknown of this treaty and of what we don't yet know is what is going to happen, and that's why it's kind of an open battleground. Probably countries are going to be reluctant to have production caps, but what we know and what we are hearing from many scientists is the fact that without decreasing plastic production is going to be difficult to protect the environment and human health. But that's a discussion that it has not started yet. So these studies, and hopefully we will have more in the next couple of years during the negotiation, will be crucial to shape how people and how governments understand plastic. So it is very welcome to have like these studies, and we really want to hear more about them.
Okay, thank you, Vito. And for Dr. Flaws, you talked about how some of the effects of plastics chemicals exposure in utero can be passed on to future generations. So when future generation individuals are re-exposed to the same chemical, are the effects exacerbated?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So in animal studies, we know with some of the chemicals, particularly studies have been done with BPA and with phthalates, that is indeed the case, that if there's a re-exposure later in life, the problems can be exacerbated. The issue in human populations, it's not been studied as much. And part of the reason is because we don't have periods of time where people are exposed to things like BPA and phthalate, and then they're no longer exposed, and then they get exposed later in life. We have really pretty continuous exposure to phthalates and BPA through in utero life, after birth, throughout our lifetime. So it's really hard to know when you've got another chemical insult coming in if that's exacerbating the problem. But clearly when people are exposed to mixtures of chemicals, oftentimes those mixture exposures are thought to be worse than exposure to a single chemical.
Mm-hmm. Is there any way to turn around or to mitigate the damage that's been inherited from your mother, grandmother, grandfather, so on? Is there any way to turn that around or to deal with that kind of damage?
So in human studies, I would say no. What I can tell you, and this is a relatively newer part of the field, there are people mainly working in zebrafish models that are trying to do genetic manipulations to take the epigenetic mutation that was caused by the chemical and to remove that epigenetic mutation to see if they can restore back to a non-exposure type phenotype. But that hasn't been done large scale, and it's very experimental and really just being done in a few animal models, maybe zebrafish right now, and some mouse models. So hard to tell whether it will be able to be turned around, and really unclear whether genetic manipulation is going to be the solution in the end either. That gets into a whole different area of controversy.
Well, as you said, I think we just have to turn off the tap.
Yeah, I think getting either alternative chemicals that we know aren't going to do these things and turning off the tap is definitely the way to go.
Thank you for that. And for the Food Packaging Forum, what kind of response have you been getting from industry or plastic manufacturers to the release of your information? I know it's fresh, it's new, and it's continuing, but what kind of pushback, or if any, are you getting from manufacturers of plastic food packaging materials? And any of you can answer, but you're going to have to unmute, please.
As far as I'm concerned, I didn't hear any pushback. So I gave a presentation in the beginning of May before it was officially released. And there was a huge interest, and that's our aim, because we want that everybody uses this resource. It's a great amount of knowledge in the database, and it should be used by everybody who is working on chemicals and food packaging. So of course, industry is welcome to use it, and we hope that we can also support their work to make food packaging safer by using the database. There was a critical voice that we would like maybe use this knowledge to scare people too much. I think that's not our intention. We want to inform. That's what we want to do, and we want to make the knowledge available. So I wouldn't call it pushback. I would call it interest at the moment.
Good, that's good. So I'm interested in how else you plan to publicize your dashboard, possibly presentations of some of the UN conferences coming up, and whether your next steps might include a dashboard listing of plastic containers that are toxic chemical free, should these exist. So that's two questions really. How are you to move out and what are next steps?
Okay, I answered again, so hopefully the next question can be answered by one of my colleagues. That would be great. At the moment, I think it's a very challenging aim to have a complete safe plastic food packaging. I think the properties of plastic make it difficult because there's almost always migration, and there are always substances which are not really well investigated. So it would be great, but I think we cannot provide it in the near future. Unfortunately, I'm sorry for that.
It's great work, absolutely stunningly well done. So congratulations on that. Then a couple of questions from our participants. One is, this has been translated. So does the food we put in white plastics produce the same harmful effects as food we would put in black plastics? Is there any kind of difference from the chemicals that might be released from white or black plastics?
I saw that, maybe I can try to, I saw that Jodi made a nice response to that written. Maybe some users saw it, but I think she pointed out rightly that all chemicals, all plastics can contain lots of different chemicals, and every plastic material is in itself often a special mixture from the manufacturer, and it's not always clear what chemicals exactly are included unless they were to put a label and tell you, right? And black plastic a few years ago got a lot of attention for contamination because there was a mixture of the streams of material that went in to make it. And in the past, it was that electronic waste sometimes ended up being mixed in with the plastic stream being used to produce black food packaging plastic. We haven't seen so many studies finding that level of contamination recently, I would say. And I think, like Jodi said, I haven't come across any specific studies really comparing white and black plastic specifically. So it's hard to make a statement there. But what we can say, like Birgit just said, is that all plastics, it's not an inert material. The chemical structure is not physically bound in itself. Anything added can freely move over time, depending on the conditions, into the food or into the environment. So you can't necessarily say that black plastic or white plastic, that either of them is either safer at this point or less safe than the other. You really have to know what the composition is and what migrates in order to really make a statement about safety.
Thank you for that. And here's another question. Considering that the recycling of plastic by the process of reduction into granules is to be banned, what are the alternative solutions? Just let me read that again.
No, I guess the follow-up question would be, I'm not sure that this has come across. Who is planning to ban? So mechanical recycling is meant? Shredding plastic down into granules to then be repressed together? That's mechanical recycling of plastic. Mm-hmm. Is that the question? Or?
I think that is the question.
I'm not sure we've heard anything about mechanical recycling in that way being banned, so we'd have to have a bit more context exactly what they're referring to or what the source is.
I'll see if anyone has a clarification of this question, but given that they're all, do you want to speak about destruction methodologies for what we've got in terms of plastic refuse? Incineration is clearly not the answer. Vito, is that something that you wouldn't want to talk about?
No, I mean, I'm trying to interpret the question, but what I'm seeing in the fact that, you know, like what we are highlighting and what more and more is being highlighted is the fact that recycling, especially for food contact materials, is particularly difficult, and I think part of what these studies that are emerging is coming out is like there's so many different chemicals, and some of them are not even intended to be in the process, and so probably recycling is a further challenge and poses additional risks to health. And we also, with some of our studies that IPEN did, we testing various types of products, we did find, you know, brominated flame retardant in hair accessories or in toys, showing that there isn't really no control of what happens to the plastic materials when they get recycled. They can go anywhere, even if the function is not important, and potentially harm vulnerable population with these chemicals. So it's not that recycling is banned, but there is a problem to recycle plastic materials that have these toxic chemicals. So that's why probably, as we have pointed out, these toxic chemicals need to get out of the virgin plastics in the first place. So it's not a matter of banning them, but how do we have a recycling that is clean?
An open question to whoever would like to answer. Chemical manufacturers are known to use a substitution method for replacing chemicals of concern. Are these manufacturers required to prove these new substitutes are not harmful to human health? If not, will regulations change in the near future if the plastic treaty becomes binding?
So I can try to answer this for the food contact materials, talking about Europe at the moment, because there is a regulation in place and the manufacturer has to guarantee that food contact materials are safe and that they don't release chemicals in level or at levels into the food which could endanger human health. That's more or less the text how it is written. But the term of safety is not really defined there. So I think that has to be done. And there is currently a process going on to make this regulation fit for its purpose. So I think that it's a very crucial point that the term of safety addresses all these important issues that, such as low dose effects, mixture effects, that it acknowledges that maybe hazards or hazardous chemicals shouldn't be there at all, independent of the level. So I think that's what we need to work on in the next years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. What about recommendations for safer alternatives? If we're not recommending a plastic lunchbox, then what should be the alternative? How do you all or anybody start generating a list of alternatives to the customary use of plastic for almost everything? Are alternatives readily available?
So if we're talking from a chemical perspective, right, just thinking about this, of course, there's lots of different impacts that food packaging has. It's not just chemicals, it's plastic pollution and CO2 emissions for climate change and others. But thinking about chemicals, it really all comes down in the end to migration. What moves out of the material itself? And we already have some materials that are known to have much, much lower levels of migration than others because they're inert. And the most common ones we see every day are stainless steel, glass, many ceramics. And these are materials where the chemical structure is bound and any additives that are included are fixed and they're not going to leach over time into the environment or the food. That's kind of the quick step that can be taken if we're talking about how to reduce exposure to hazardous chemicals from food packaging. It's to use materials that don't allow them to move or migrate in the first place.
Okay.
Can I make a quick comment? Sorry, to go back to the previous question, because Birgit discussed the regulations in the European Union and just generally across Europe. And I wanted to say real quick that in the United States, the majority of at least new chemicals that have become certified for use in food contact have been certified through the generally recognized as safe rule, which is where the chemical company does their own studies and determines the safety of the chemical in that way. And then the Food and Drug Administration in the US is changing some of the ways that they handle looking at food contact chemicals and materials. But the agency has received a lot of critical feedback recently about how they deal with food and food contact. So that might change, or it will hopefully change.
Yes, we can only hope. One last question. What other scientific studies would help with IPEN's policy goals? And Vito, I believe this is a question for you.
It is a good question that I don't know to which extent I can answer, because like it becomes like very overwhelming, and I just want to go back, like just referring to what also Birgit was saying on the fact that there's like just generally having public resources to be put at like the assessment of all these chemicals, the assessment of all these materials. It seems like an exercise that is not going to lead to more safety, because like the substitutes tend to be more toxic, the migration issue is not solved. And so as Justin was saying, probably, you know, substituting with materials that we know don't cause these health effects is probably the best solution from a regulatory point of view. But in terms of studies, what we need is to get always more data on the harm of these chemicals and highlighted all over the world. But that also shows like the weakness of the system, where the onus is being put on not on the industry, but on the regulators, on the citizens, on the scientists to show these harms. So there is something fundamentally flawed in how plastics are regulated right now, and the associated chemicals, of course.
Thank you for that comment. I think we've come to the end of our time. Do any of you have any last comments you would like to make before we end this webinar? Any last minute thoughts, comments, questions to be answered in the future? Anything you'd like to add? This is your last chance to say a few more words in closure.
Maybe I'll repeat quickly what Lindsey said earlier, which is that we put this data together to have it help answer questions people have. So we're hoping that when questions come up in policy making decisions or from industry representatives or in governments, that we can give you this tool to use yourself. And when you need help, we can jump in and try to pull out the data you need from the science to help answer the questions that you might not have enough information about. So let us know what your feedback is and what kind of help we can provide with this resource.
Great, thank you.
I will just add, I would just add to that I noticed in the chat some people are asking for slides or some other information. I'm more than happy to share my slides if they can either contact the organizer of this webinar or just email me directly, and I'm happy to share my slides and send any information that people would like.
Thank you, Dr. Flores. Vito, any last minute comment?
I just would like to compliment the research team that put together all these studies, because they will indeed be very useful for and it seems to be also a first step to then understand like how much of these chemicals are actually regulated, which chemicals should be a priority for being eliminated. So I just hope to see more of this coming and more resonance to this and cooperation with civil society. So great job. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you all for your excellent presentations and your willingness to answer these questions. Much appreciated. And we hope to get updates as the process moves forward to get toxic chemicals out of plastics and other food containing materials. It's incredibly important that we should not be consuming toxics in the food we eat. All right, thank you all very much. And I'll turn this back over to the IPEN organizers to give us a closing slide. Thank you very much.